Greetings, friends. It is my pleasure to welcome you virtually today to the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies located at the University of Notre Dame. My name is Garrett Fitzgerald, and I am the Ethics, Politics, and Community Justice Fellow here at the Institute. Today's panel discussion is part of the Kroc Institute's multi-year strategic commitment to bringing intersectional approaches to peace and justice to the center of our research and teaching agendas, in part by featuring the work of scholar practitioners whose attentiveness to the complex overlap of power and identity underscores the indispensability of an intersectional lens to engaging in peace research, practice, and education. Today's roundtable features some of the Institute's recent alumni, research fellows, and visiting faculty who are contributing to what we hope is the increasingly central engagement with intersectional theory and methods in peace studies and adjacent disciplines. Dr. Marco Scalzo is a former research fellow here at the Kroc Institute and is a current assistant professor of political science at Quinnipiac University. His research lies at the intersection of international relations and identity politics with a concentration on post-colonial Latin America. He has directed 2 research documentaries about indigenous activisms in Argentina and Bolivia, which inspired his recent book, Intersectional Decoloniality, Reimagining IR and the Problem of Difference, which engages indigenous voices to provide new pathways for reimagining the problem of difference in international relations, the continuing impacts of legacies of colonialism, and the prospects for global peace and coexistence. Dr. Jana Hunter-Bowman is a graduate of the Kroc Institute's PhD program in Peace Studies and Theology and a former scholar in residence at the Institute as well. Dr. Hunter-Bowman is Associate Professor of Peace Studies and Christian Social Ethics and Director of the Peace Studies program at Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary in Elkhart, Indiana. Her first book project, Witnessing Peace, Becoming Agents Under Duress in Colombia, is rooted in 10 years of peace building and research in Latin America. Her current engaged research focuses on agents under duress in a different context, undocumented immigrants in the United States, and features collaboration with Movimiento Cosecha. Her research and teaching interests occur at the intersection of peace studies, peace theology, political theology, engaged action research, ethnographically driven theology, and Latin American critical studies. Dr. Justin De Leon is a former research fellow and visiting assistant professor at the Kroc Institute, a current senior advisor with the Institute's mediation program, and an incoming assistant professor and director in the ethnic studies program at Chapman University. His praxis-based research explores engagements of tradition and culture of the Lakota Sioux of South Dakota and their continued challenging and navigation of settler colonial orders. Also a visual artist and documentary filmmaker, his award-winning work has been screened at over 250 universities across North America. Dr. De Leon also co-hosts the Pedagogies for Peace podcast with Kroc Institute faculty member Dr. Ashley Borer. And finally, Dr. Elena Stavrevska, a former Kroc Research Fellow, is currently a research officer at the Center for Women, Peace, and Security at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Her work engages with issues of gender, intersectionality, and political economy in conflict-affected societies, with recent publications including the entry on intersectionality and peace in the Paul Grave Encyclopedia of Peace and Conflict Studies, and the article A Different Women, Peace, and Security is Possible, Intersectionality in Women, Peace, and Security Resolutions and National Action Plans. She is a member of the Yugoslav Women Plus Collective, with which she works on issues of knowledge production, especially in regards to the post-Yugoslav space. Thank you all so much for joining us today for this conversation. We'll have 2 rounds of questions for our panelists, followed by some time for Q&A from the audience. And so we encourage you all to submit any questions you have for our panelists through the Zoom window. Our first question concerns our panelists' own work. And so beginning with Dr. Scalzo, I'd love to hear how has an attention to the intersections of various identities and forms of power informed your own research and teaching? Are there any particular cases or examples from your experiences where this approach has proved particularly important?
Thank you so much, Garrett. It's absolutely wonderful seeing everyone and being back at the Kroc Institute after a couple of years being a little bit farther east. I think intersectionality has a little bit of a personal touch to some extent. It's informed a lot of my own experiences here in the United States as an immigrant coming from Argentina. But more in connection to my work and my research, I think that the aspects of intersectionality have informed a lot of the possibilities to think about the different axes of power that cut across the different areas of work that I do. In terms of service, for instance, here at Quinnipiac University, the notions of intersectionality have allowed me to think a little bit more in depth about some of the axis of power that not only affect my own personal experience, but perhaps also privilege my experience in some ways. So intersectionality to me has enabled the possibility to think reflexively about the different ways in which we interact with different axes of power, some of which may be problematic for some of us, being, for example, an immigrant, or perhaps having an accent or a different language or a different way of dressing or something of the sort in a university that it's 89% white, but also the privileges that come with, for example, institutional power. So in terms of service, the possibility of including intersectionality has allowed us to think about different possibilities of working in spaces and creating spaces at Quinnipiac University, like, for example, open forums or the conversations with student unions and such that have been really fruitful. In terms of my research, I've moved a little bit from the analysis of decolonial voices in Latin America to the analysis of colonial legacies in the construction of Latin America by the United States, and the ways in which epistemic politics play out in that construction. And one of the things that I'm finding that I think is very interesting is that epistemic politics play with intersectionality in two slightly different ways. On one side, epistemic politics, such as, for example, ontological notions of what is real in the West, often entail ideas of humanity, notions of what aspect of humanity is the unquestionable foundational source of reality in discourses like Lockean notions of liberalism play a very important role. Those notions create access of power within in the consistency of epistemic politics. That is, the notion of a humanity creates an idea that then classifies how far or close we are from the possibility of knowing reality. And that hierarchicalizing effect creates a single sort of axis of power within each discourse. So that's one way in which it plays, right? Each discourse creates its own axis of power, and then other discourses might, in a sense, confront it or to conflict with it or to become dominant at different eras. The other notion of intersectionality that has that plays interestingly with epistemic politics is from within each notion of humanity, the ways in which this hierarchy is codified creates different experiences for the different stereotypes of identities. So, for instance, the notion of humanity in early constructions of the United States created ideas of criminality as a category that was far away from rationality and as a threat sometimes to rationality, and therefore an identity that had to be punished and separated and lost value and all the hierarchicalizing effects. But within the notion of criminality, gender cuts across and creates different experiences. Ethnicity cuts across and creates different experiences. Sexuality cuts across and creates different experiences. So in a sense, epistemic politics create from the notions of ontology one consistent axis of power to say how far are we from that humanity. But even within that, the codification of that hierarchy creates parallel categories that cut across and create different experiences. So I think those are the two different ways in which it's played out in much of my research.
Great, thanks so much. Dr. Hunter Bowman.
Well, thank you so much. It's such a treat to be back here. And thank you so much, Garrett, for convening us for this conversation. For me, I came to think with questions of intersectionality when I was trying to make sense of the complex, what seemed like an inscrutable situation and tangle of oppressions with the communities that I was accompanying in Colombia specifically. I was going to say Latin America, but I want to just focus on communities in rural Colombia. And so I think that I've already said what is most important and helpful in terms of a tool for analysis in terms of my research. And that is a tool that helps us to examine what can the various kinds of oppression in what can seem like an inscrutable situation, or often just what looks like the status quo. So that for me has been very important to be able to think with that. And in terms of doing that work of unpacking, what I've done is to bring intersectional and a decolonial lens into liberation theology's a liberative hermeneutic in order to understand what's going on the ground. When I was doing human rights and peace building work in Colombia, oftentimes communities talked about themselves as being absent, or not. The language is often used as we're not taken into consideration, or they treat us like we're absent. And so thinking with these lens was a way of making sense of that production of absence. And that language of absence is, of course, not that's something that Gustavo Gutierrez and others in liberation theology work with quite a bit. But what we see in liberation theology is that there are certain people and there are particularly certain faces that are deeply absent. And Black Latin Americans would be one people that is absent. And so an intersectional lens helps to think with, and to really then expand on the ways of thinking more precisely about what makes a people absent. And then in the cases of these communities that were deeply engaged communities, what I call agents under duress. So these are communities that are working to transform the various violences, even as they're suffering them. And these kinds of this lens helps to make sense of the various, like Marcos was saying, the different axes that are at work here. As oftentimes people would start community meetings, if there was an invitation to talk about a particular situation of war or a particular conflict or a human rights situation, initially, much to my surprise, people would start with, well, when the Spanish came. So the coloniality was a very real and present reality. So that is to say, the colonial and neo-colonial patterns were evident, but it was not always easy to see how those kinds of patterns then were related to the particular conditions of the possibility of massacre that a given community was suffering. So bringing a decolonial lens into conversation with an intersectional lens for this liberative hermeneutic was extremely helpful for me as I tried to think through, well, what does being Black in this community have to do with this particular situation? What is it being poor in this particular situation? How does this come about? What does it mean that this particular community is evangelical in a predominantly Catholic country? So the intersectional lens became really useful in trying to parse through these different realities. And a particular strategy that I think was for me really revelatory and is a very concrete tool in both my own research and that I've seen it very useful, that I've seen students find it really useful as well, is Kimberly Crenshaw's invitation to look at a given policy and to consider who benefits from this policy and who is made invisible by it. And that very simple tool, that very simple strategy is highly revelatory for me in this case in Colombia, in this particular region of Colombia, tracing the existence of slavery and abolition, And then the implementation, or the lack thereof, really taught so much and revealed so much about what was going on the ground in terms of economics and in terms of the becoming of capitalism in this particular region. So here you have, just in such stark terms, racialization and capitalism, and then in a particular area. So that would be one way in which a particular tool was very revelatory. I think I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Dr. DeLeo.
So I come to this work by way of trying to make sense of who I am and where I am. My family comes from an indigenous region of the Philippines, which really kind of helps me grapple with this paradox of being both a product of colonial displacement, but at the same time furthering some of the same forces of displacement and violence. So how can I be a product and a producer? Here in the United States, thinking about what Audre Lorde talks about, this survival in what she calls the mouth of the dragon, surviving as a racialized body in a space that, you know, we're all striving just to be, but this space is urging us to be like something else. A world that sort of casts good versus evil, white versus black, savage versus civilized, doesn't allow for those gradations. It doesn't allow for, you know, in a literal sense, of brownness in the conversation of white and black. I think these binaries also mask some of the realities of survival, some of the realities of survivance, if you're familiar with that term, negotiations, but also complicity. So I'm here and I come to this work because my family left the Philippines in the 1970s. I think of that moment a lot when they left their community. My mom would tell me as like a young person that they left their community and their relatives and their community came to see them off, and they had a celebration. They sent them off with prayers, with dreams of a new life for everyone and for them. Tears, laughter, joyfulness, and hugs. I think about that moment often. I think about, what were those prayers? What were those dreams that my family was sent off to this new world, not to return back to our homelands in any permanent way? I think my challenge now is thinking about, how do we hear? How do we listen? How do we make ourselves open to those moments that have shaped where we've come from and who we are? It's a sort of a diasporic, dislocated struggle to hear, right? That's often masked by the comforts of modernity and sort of the reactive realities of being racialized bodies in the United States. I think many of us know, and many of us feel and have experienced, that modernity, patriarchy, settler colonialism, capitalism, it separates us in many different ways. It sort of bifurcates who we are and where we came from into sort of discrete beings and subjects. Particularly when it comes to Black and Brown folks, we know that there's this paradox of being sort of hyper visible and yet rendered invisible. And Patricia Hill Collins talks about this, but also Audre Lorde talks about it, and also Eve Tuck. Blackness, racialized bodies are known, they're traded, they're commodified. And in that space, there's no space for awe. There's no space for wonder. There's no space for curiosity. It creates discord. I think it reminds me of, there's a Lakota story that talks about looking at yourself in a pond, and on a clear day you see yourself clear and you see yourself as being beautiful and placid, but then other days you look in and you see someone angry, you see a distorted figure because it's windy or stormy, and you conflate that with your true nature, when in fact it's just the storm of the day passing through. That's what I would say some of the forces of colonialism and displacement bring to a lot of those who live through that. So ultimately, because of that, my work is thinking about how to make human types, as you would say, opposed to stereotypes. And I think of that in relationship to Eve Tuck's work in 2009. My work, which I could talk about later, and maybe the second question that we have, tries to build coherence and sort of allow people to step into visibility. We often think about that notion of braiding together a full human being of mind, body, and spirit in a world that tries to pathologize or criminalize brown bodies. So my research and teaching, it's shaped by the values that I think about when I think about my ancestors, the values that I think about folks who've lived in and made this land their home for centuries, where worldviews and epistemologies and ways of practicing peace, practicing politics have been erased. One of the principles that motivates my teaching and research is that we're a spiritual being having a material existence. And in this material existence, we have identities that have material outcomes, and yet as spiritual beings, we don't have those identities. Somewhere along the way, right, they're sort of created and socially constructed. And our tool, as Marco pointed to, is our task, as Marco pointed to, is to think about the power relations that have created those subjectivities. My work is motivated by a curiosity that allows students to bring their whole selves to the table, a curiosity that gives me pause to try to listen to what my ancestors say to me and what the prayers they brought with my family. It's a humility and a curiosity that's also open to various lived experiences and also worldviews. And that puts me into this space that we would label in an academic setting as sort of intersectional and also decolonial. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And then finally, for the first question, Dr. Stavrevska.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's very nice to see familiar faces on the screen and in the attendees list as well. The great thing about going last is that a lot of the great points are already made, so you can just throw them together. So me coming to intersectionality in many ways is similar to what Marcus and Justin were saying as well. For me, intersectionality was a way to understand my own positionality, but also my own background story in many ways. In a world where, well, I come from the Balkans, and as a region from where you often need to apply for visas, I've always been frustrated with pick only one forms. And for me, the world in which I operate without intersectionality is a pick only one kind of world. So as a woman and as an Eastern European immigrant currently living in London, but also previously in other places of the global north, but also a person coming from a region that has been over-researched, or as Justin said, in relation to something else, both overly visible and invisible. Much of intersectionality answers a lot of my frustration of being able to be multiple things, to understand multiple things at the same time. And of course, my initial instinct was to look at some of the feminist literature that comes from the former Yugoslavia. And of course, there's a lot written about the double burden regarding women workers. But even in Yugoslavia, there was very little grappling with the position of, let's say, Roma women. The position of a lot of people who were invisible within that striving for unity and equality, even then. So my understanding of intersectionality in many ways is not only about identities that are attached to bodies, but also about how, in my case, given that I come from a space that has been intervened in heavily for different reasons, how in this case of intervention, for instance, practices of intervention are also premised on certain global racial and other hierarchies that have these long historical roots. So it goes beyond who speaks and opens up the space of what spaces are created and what historical legacies are there for people's silences. In terms of, and I also want to mention here that intersectionality for me has been a way of also understanding my identity in different spaces. so moving across spaces, while in the Balkans I might be perceived as one thing, and be subject to certain power relations in the UK or in the US or wherever else, I would be subject to other relations of power. And this makes you aware of course, the oppression, but also the privileges that come with the possibility of navigating different spaces. Now, in terms of research, as a curious feminist, as Cynthia Enlow would say, I have always been interested in, maybe not always, but I have been interested in the silences and the erasures, not who is present, but who is absent and why. So, for instance, to give an example, for my doctoral research, which now was a while back, I researched Bosnia, and looking at the Dayton Agreement, which very much amplifies this speak only one understanding of the world, where you can be only one thing of the three ethnicities that are the constitutional peoples. Everyone else fell through the cracks. All the other ethnicities, women, young people, you name it, let alone those whose lived experiences are informed by different intersections. More recently, I have looked at the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, which I trust everyone is familiar with, but on the off chance someone is not. These are 10 UN Security Council resolutions that acknowledge the particular effect in the particular ways wars and conflicts are gendered, and therefore the particular effect war and conflict has on women and girls. And more recently, they've also acknowledged the effect on men and boys as well, which is another binary that we don't have time to delve into right now. And so this agenda has been praised as something very progressive, as, oh, we're finally paying attention to women, and so on and so on. The criticism of it is endless. But even those who have used, and a lot of activists have used this as a way of lobbying with their governments to do more, even those who've used the agenda do sometimes fall victim to the blind spots of the agenda. And those are very much intersectional. They're intersectional in terms of both what Kimberly Crenshaw would call structural and political intersectionality, in terms of what structures are acknowledged in the agenda, and in terms of who gets to speak and shape the agenda. So there's very little room. There's been this approach with those of us who work with gender issues would call add women and stir. So there has very much been an approach of, you know, just adding different identities rather than accounting for intersectional relations. And two final points. I think, I mean, we'll speak about this more later, but I think in terms of teaching sometimes, how we can bring intersectionality even to those disciplines that are not necessarily the obvious, the go-to discipline to speak about intersectionality. And I think this is important. For instance, at some point, to give an example, I was teaching an introductory class to comparative politics, and we're meant to talk about the formation of nation, which in and of itself is problematic, but again, another whole seminar topic. And so one of the things that was supposed to be assigned, and was assigned ultimately, was Benedict Anderson, Imagined Communities. But by assigning a reading that goes with it, like Partha Chatterjee's Nation and Its Fragments, which questions imagined by whom are these nations or communities, it starts challenging these, as I said, longer historical roots of intersecting power relations. And the final thing is, I think that we also need to bring these questions into, and that's not all, that's just one example, but I'm mindful of time. We also need to bring these questions to how we do research. And how we do research, by that I also mean from the academy to the field, because they're not separate, from how we conceptualize consent forms to what anonymity means, who gets the privilege of choosing to be anonymous, who actually would like to speak because of centuries of erasure and silencing, and how we can make room for that in our research, or another set of questions that we should continue asking. I'll stop there for now, but more later.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for those really rich responses. Picking up on some of the insights that you all left us with there, the second question I have for you today concerns the field more broadly, and particularly what work is getting you all excited these days. And so the question is, do you see any important developments or exciting work happening around the incorporation of intersectional approaches within the field of peace studies or in other academic spaces in which you participate? I would absolutely invite you to center your own current and upcoming projects here. I'd love to hear if there are spaces or developments to which you feel the field should be more attentive. And perhaps a little bit more pointedly, what enduring challenges and opportunities do you see for improving the field of peace studies or other spaces in which you participate by utilizing intersectional approaches? Where have these insights not yet taken root? Oh, sorry. And in terms of order, I think we'll flip this around. And so Dr. Stavrevska, if we could maybe start with you this time.
Okay, and I will take up that invitation and spotlight something that, Garrett, you are a part of, as well as Slađana, who is in the audience. We're currently working on many years in the making now, special issue on decolonial and feminist approaches to peace and peace research as well, which brings together scholars from many different places in the world. A lot of collective work done, a lot of individual work done. And you understand how, by reading these, which will hopefully be out next year in the Journal of State Building and Intervention, by reading these different contributions that Slađana and I have had the privilege of editing, you realize how so many of the struggles are the same. So that has, I mean, they're not the same, but they resonate across spaces. So beyond that, I have also worked on bringing into conversation some of the discussions around intersectionality and peace, or I think intersectionality pops in almost as a given. And peace is another strange one because it's not called peace everywhere. I mean, like if you bring up peace as a concept in where I come from, many people will challenge it. Some would think of that as an intervention, not the concept of positive peace necessarily. People in Kosovo would think of, not all of them, of course, but mainly would think of peace as freedom and so on and so on. Some would think of peace as social justice. So it's also about what the potential uniform understanding of peace, or speaking of peace as singular, what kind of violence comes with that. I have been working on bringing into conversation peace scholars and sometimes activists as well from the global South and the global East. So what do we gain? And I don't know if this is a development. I want it to be a development in peace studies, but what do we gain by having the West as non-audience, by moving beyond the West and the global North as the one that we usually speak to? Not necessarily in terms of language. After all, language is just a tool, but in terms of epistemology, in terms of what exciting conversations, what exciting solidarities we can build across spaces if we move beyond that focus. That's one question. The second thing is that I've seen a lot, more work being done as collectives. I'm part of a collective, as Garrett said, which is exciting in and of itself for me, but and hopefully for the other people in the collective. But I think in terms of how we learn and how we check ourselves and how we acknowledge different understanding even of the simplest things like peace, for instance, can come from collective work, from learning with and from one another. And a third thing, and I think I'll stop with that. A third thing is I'm starting to see, or maybe I'm paying more attention to it. So I'm not sure whether this is something that hasn't been there, but I see more people starting to pay attention to the so-called citation politics, even in peace studies. So peace studies is, now it's opening up to be more than just a field of just speaking about interventions, but traditionally, even in these pieces about intervention, you will very rarely see people being cited from the country's scholars or activists or whatever else form of knowledge there might be, poems, songs, whatever, from the societies that are being intervened in. So even when you write about the society, it's always about the society, it's never with society. So I'm seeing slightly more awareness, and there's plenty to go, but slightly more awareness for citation politics and for the importance of bringing in voices of and acknowledging the agency of those who for whom peace is being brought. And that's a problematic thing in and of itself as well, but we can return to it in the discussion. I'll stop there for now. Last thing. I am very excited about the prospect, although it's a very, very minimal prospect, about discussion starting to be there, and hopefully our special issue does this as well, about not just critiquing what is, but also imagining things otherwise. And that takes a lot of unlearning, I think. I've been talking a lot about unlearning. It takes a lot of imagination beyond the structures that do not necessarily, that have never encouraged this. So I'll stop there now.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. De Leon.
Hello, everyone. My computer just died, so I have no notes anymore. But I'm going to share what my thoughts are about this. When we think of intersections, I think we often think about vulnerabilities. Kimberly Crenshaw allowed us to think about vulnerabilities in a new way so that we can be attentive to resist in new ways. I think it's a very worthwhile endeavor to think about how to resist, how to identify particular vulnerabilities in this social constructed world. Where my interests lie is not necessarily in resisting, but it's in building. Similar to what Elena had mentioned, right? What is versus what could be otherwise. This notion of building implies that instead of seeing these intersections as spaces of vulnerability, how can we see these intersections as spaces in which to build, spaces in which we can theorize from, spaces of power? And I think of this in relationship to, say, if we have a visual where we have sort of these intersecting identities and intersecting nodes where power is operating, I like to also think about constellations. When we think of constellations, we think of a singular star that has its brightness, that's doing what it's doing. And as it becomes put into relationship with other stars, it creates this constellation. Kanaka Maoli, indigenous Hawaiians, indigenous Filipinos used to use constellations to guide themselves when they're in open waters. So the idea of thinking about how being in constellation with other folks who are doing meaningful work can actually act as a more meaningful guide in thinking through sort of navigations of these settler realities is something that I think about when I think about casting a sort of movement to build rather than just to react or to resist. Some of the things that I think about when I'm thinking about building, some of the work that I draw from, I try to think of scholars that sort of speak to our highest aspirations, people like folks that are really near and dear to us, like John Paul Lederach, Jackie Alexander, Chandra Mohanty, Leanne Simpson, as mentioned, Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, James Baldwin, these folks that are asking us to think about something otherwise, as was recently put, something beyond. And so to that, my work now is in about a month's time, I'm working on this creative sovereignty lab. And it's called Creative Sovereignty because it references a piece that I worked on with Matt Wildcat from University of Alberta, which actually talks specifically about sovereignty, indigenous sovereignty as a space of in between what is and what ought to be, right? Or this is and what otherwise can be. So if we start thinking away from just being reactive and surviving, and we start thinking about what are the types of worlds we want to build, That's what this Creative Sovereignty Lab is. So it's a 3-month program where we're making a feature film and pairing professional production crew with members of the First Nations community of Fort Williams Reserve, which is in the Six Nations reservation up just north of Minnesota. We recently got a 6-figure grant from the Canadian Council of the Arts, and we're working with this entity called the Indigenous Screen Office. The Indigenous Screen Office is the entity that created this Pathways and Protocol document in 2019 that put forward a guide of how to interact and make films with Indigenous peoples. The premise of what we're doing, which is similar to that sort of logic of, instead of just being sort of reactive or thinking about vulnerability and moving to strength, is premised on this notion of what some have called this Hollywood paradox. So the Hollywood paradox would be simply, on TV shows and in film, you see an increasing number of people of color on screen, but you see not the same changes behind the camera, right? So that's a paradox. To add on to that, which is the critical element that we're adding, is the deeper question of what happens when you actually have Indigenous people, folks of color behind the camera. Are we to believe that the Hollywood structure of storytelling, filmmaking, and distribution, sex sells, if it bleeds, it leads, are we to believe that that's going to remain intact, right? And so it's this very interesting sort of parallel to thinking about when we think about intersectionality and we think of the vulnerabilities that place certain peoples under danger, can we reframe that and think about what are those particular lived experiences and points of view that allow that intersection to be a new space of transformation? So we're working on what it means to see film as a protagonist for community change. What does it mean to see film and storytelling from an Indigenous oral history perspective as a protagonist for peaceful and flourishing communities? What does it mean to see oneself represented in practice in terms of non-hierarchical ways of doing production, but also in storytelling? The story that we're telling is about a young Black girl who finds out she's also Indigenous and tries to reconcile these seemingly two disparate identities, socially constructed as disparate, but in the end, finding that looking for another element of themselves, they find themselves sort of returning back into themselves. We draw heavily from the work of Leanne Simpson, Glenn Coulthard, and also Taiki Alfred around this notion of Indigenous resurgence. And I'll offer that also to think about what Elena had mentioned around this otherwise, right? What is otherwise? Indigenous resurgence asks us, can we reclaim ourselves by looking backwards? What has been tried to be erased through modernity and capitalism? Can we take some of those gems and move them into a contemporary setting? Some of the spaces I'm seeing this is a place called Deshinta Bush University up in Yellowknife. It's a completely outdoor university that relies on knowledge, community-based knowledge and elders. I think of the Creative Sovereignty Lab, which we're doing up in Thunder Bay. And I also think of the relational governance. There's a relational governance space that's also being created at University of Alberta. So ultimately what I would say is that I think so many of us, including the communities I work with, we're tired of struggling. We're tired of resisting all the time. And we want to think of something new. And I think intersectionality can be used to get to those spaces of thinking about something new. Are we to believe that someone who's lived their entire life and experience at these dangerous intersections doesn't have something to offer in terms of how the structure of those intersections are even constructed in the first place? Of course they do. And so the broader question is to think otherwise, to think what is next? How can these tools, these analytic tools, be used to empower, to allow students who come into our classroom to see themselves as full human beings, to allow folks who've been marginalized and left out of the academy to finally see themselves represented and their communities represented. Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you. Dr. Hunter Bowman.
Thank you. It's so much fun just to hear what everyone's working on. It's a real treat. I think I will start with Garrett's invitation to think about what are the limitations and what are we doing with some of these limitations, and then move into some of the ways in which I think people are working creatively with this, in which some of us are trying to work creatively with this. And I should say again here, I work in peace studies and in theology. And so I'm particularly thinking about intersectionality with this field of Christian theology, and then in view of experiences of lived theologies and spiritualities. So I think I'm going to start by just reading an excerpt from a chapter that I wrote. It's representation and intersectionality in the Wiley-Blackwell Companion to Theology and Qualitative Research, that we're thinking with some of these questions. So the limitation that would have to be named for someone who is in theology and peace studies is that intersectionality does have a particular limitation that's pertinent to scholars of Christian theology and ethicists who employ it, and that is its epistemic problem with religion. It hasn't come up, but I'm sure this is something that others are working with as well and certainly thinking about. Some intersectional scholars exclude religion from the analysis altogether. Others, like Lynn Weber, rightly highlight religion as a carrier of oppression without acknowledging embodied theologies, spiritualities, and moral traditions among the sources of power operative in the resistance to oppression that scholars of intersectionality champion, that many of us are working with. And these are particularly these spaces that we want to work in to think otherwise. So in this case, say a Lynn White also ignores the well-documented religious and theological contributions to social movements like the civil rights movements towards social justice that intersectionality pursues. In the same vein, Lynn White extols alternative consciousness to face dominant cultural oppression, yet without recognizing that theologies and spiritualities sometimes play a role in this nurturing resource. And perhaps this habit of exclusion and reductionism of religion make intersectionality feel like something of a taciturn conversation partner for scholars of Christian theology and ethics. And maybe that is why there are relatively few who have taken up intersectionality by name. And I really want to emphasize by name here. And there are meaningful exceptions to this, and I will get to some more of the really recent ones. But Ramsey, Kim, and Shaw are a few who've taken up and published on intersectionality explicitly. And there are acknowledgements in footnotes and bibliography, like with Tracy West. But it may also be that this sense of exclusion is because feminist, womanist, and mujerista theologians have been working with ideas that are very akin to intersectionality before they were so brilliantly gathered into the single term that Crenshaw has put forward, that she coined. So a systematic theologian by the name of Elena Wola traces historical records showing that feminist theologians from around the world theorized intersectionality earlier than other fields of feminist studies. So we have Black feminist theologians and womanist theologians addressing the multiple oppressions and triple jeopardy of Black women in the 1970s. And this would perhaps be not a surprise insofar as women are very aware of the ways in which their theological traditions are oppressing them, even as they're aware of the ways in which they're finding a nurturing resource or a resource for operating in the world simultaneously. Voices from the Global South contributed to feminist theologies that address the interplay of religion with patriarchy, sexism, racism, and global economic injustice in the aftermath of colonialism and in the wake of neocolonialism. Here we have a long string of theologians who've been doing this work. But if the absence of a complex account of religion and moral sources of hope for transformation towards justice is something of a limitation of intersectionality scholarship, generally speaking, then Tracy West's defiant spirituality is a powerful rejoinder. She doesn't mention the term intersectionality, but she does work with theories and methods that are really sharing key insights. She's working with some of the same tools even. She draws on literatures on feminism and gender, including theologians and intersectional scholars. She sought out encounters with activist leaders in Ghana, Brazil, and South Africa concerning anti-violence activism, race, ethnicity, gender, and religion. And she's working with these voices as her interlocutors, as the sources of knowledge to help us think differently, to help us think otherwise, as the term has so rightly already been brought up here. She writes, as a major cultural influence found in the places I travel, Christian religion arises as both part of the problem of cultural support for male perpetrated intimate violence against women and girls, and is sometimes a helpful resource for countering it. Her study of the role of religion focuses on relations of power and practices that are needed to envision political transformation. And she simultaneously attends to the cultural and systemic patterns of gender-based violence, especially related to religion and racism against the most stigmatized, end of quote. Her book is instructive because it shows how scholars of Christian theology and ethics who employ such methods help to redress the limitations of intersectional scholarship while they're using the resources of intersectionality to help us think about new possibilities. And then, so that's, I'm going to stop reading from this chapter. And maybe just, I also want to note a few other places where I see this work happening in interesting ways. And again, oftentimes without naming intersectionality, but I think we just cannot deny the influence of the extremely powerful insights that make it impossible to deny certain oppressions and certain realities, and the ways in which that has been operating in our traditions. And just to name one very close to home. So as someone who comes from and is operating within what is called the historic Peace Church tradition, there is a time-honored conversation around peace and violence. War, peace, and revolution, pacifism, and just war are the venerable categories that are so often discussed. What intersectionality has done is to show the way in which that is a European conversation among a certain group of white men, by and large. And so now you will see in new texts that are coming out, such as a volume called The Field Guide to Nonviolence, instead of talking about these as if they were these binary options, instead talking about different streams of nonviolence and the kinds of imaginaries and the possibilities that accompany these imaginaries that are always contextual, always that are geographically rooted in particular experiences and are understood thus. So that is one example of the way in which a whole tradition is really being shaken in necessary ways. Another project is going on at the Colgate Rochester Divinity School, where Hilary Scarcella is a person who's a professor there, who is looking at intersectional work in conversation with theologies for human flourishing. This is a whole project that she's working on there. And then outside of the academy, I would also name the dialogue projects in Columbia, in post-accord Columbia. There are projects that are just called difficult dialogue projects. And in the ones that I've been involved with, a explicitly intersectional lens is used when thinking about who's going to be involved and how we are going to get the right people in the room to think differently about the kind of nation and the kind of democracy building that we're interested in doing. So thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. And then finally back to Dr. Scauso.
Thank you very much, Garrett. So I guess part of my experience, in a sense, it's a little bit different from Dr. Saveska and Dr. DeLeon, in the sense that throughout the time that I spent at the Kroc Institute, I was thinking quite a bit about the possibilities of being otherwise, or thinking about politics otherwise. growing up in Argentina as an activist, and then moving from Argentina to other places, thinking about politics, constantly confronted some of the assumptions that I was making as an activist. I remember being the first time in Bolivia and talking from a Marxist perspective, and a couple of activists saying, well, that's a very Eurocentric approach to understanding forms of justice. And that was one of the first times in which some of my more activist understandings were so directly confronted in an intersectional sense. And from there, my entire book, Intersectional Decoloniality, is essentially a journey in which I tried to think about the different limitations that different approaches, anti-colonial approaches, bring. So from there, I tried now to move a little bit more to the study of colonial legacies, to a focus that is much more directly connected to the unlearning that Dr. Straveska was mentioning earlier. So a lot of the work in which I've been focusing is the analysis of current and continuous epistemic politics and the construction of Latin America. As a possibility to unlearn, as a possibility to think about the borders, the boundaries, the limitations, and the biases that constrained certain perspectives, or that we feel in our work. So I guess that's, just to kind of clarify it in relationship to my work, I guess, how intersectionality fits with more current projects. For the second part, I'd like to focus a little more about the question that is connected to the feel. It's interesting. I was thinking about this, and as somebody that also works in terms of service as a chair of Inclusive Excellence Teaching Lab and in other spaces that are related to possibilities of inclusivity in pedagogy and teaching at my university, I often find that words like decolonial, decolonizing, intersectionality have become somewhat of an approach that it's both everywhere and also, I don't want to say nowhere, of course, but in few places to some extent. They have become a little bit, in some instances, a little bit of a buzzword used in some cases. And sometimes that traveling opens up spaces and opens up possibilities of dialogue and discussion. But at the same time, I wonder what is lost in that translation, what is lost in a more tokenizing usage of the possibilities that these approaches might bring when we think about the work of Kimberly Crenshaw and others, right? So as a buzzword, I wondered, for instance, how does intersectionality require us, in a sense, or call on us to think about deeper epistemic possibilities of multiplicity? That is, I think that intersectionality calls on us to think about a world of multiple worlds. And in order to be able to do something like that, to think about those possibilities, we have to be able to, in a sense, think about our own epistemic politics and the ways in which we elevate specific notions of structured and ordered that might then provide different assimilating tendencies upon other struggles. So even the work of Mignolo and Catherine Walsh, 2018, Decoloniality, for instance, talks about possibilities of plurality and possibility of listening to multiple struggles. But in the middle of the book, Mignolo brings the idea that there's an overarching umbrella that can explain multiple struggles. And that notion is connected to geopolitics, for instance. So how do we think about our own elevation of specific ideas that then create ordering and assimilating and categorizing tendencies? I think it's something that brings us to think about decoloniality and intersectionality and the relationship between the two in a deeper sense. And that's something that I see a little bit less, perhaps, to some extent. But I do see it, of course. I mean, the work of Black feminist movements and Black feminist scholars, together with other scholars from Green theory, indigenous studies, settler colonialism, the work of Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui in decoloniality has provided very interesting possibilities to think about these epistemic questions about our own assumptions in a way. And more recently, I've been trying to understand a little bit more of queer theory in Latin America, specifically in Argentina, because of the strength of the feminist movement in Argentina and a lot of the things and the lessons that it's providing. And I think that that's also really interesting work on intersectionality that does take into account this epistemic, deeper questions of how we elevate certain ideas that then assimilate other notions, or how we may avoid those to think otherwise, as Justin DeLeon and Elena Chavez were inviting us to do. Recently, there's a very interesting book that came out by Macon, Solana, and Bacareza about the role of affection, for example, the possibilities of thinking about how contradictory, how messy, circular, and fast sometimes the dimensions of affection unfold on or happen, not just within the individual. This is very much in connection to politics as well. And so they put the example of the green scarf movement in Argentina and the ways in which affection from all kinds of corners kept defining the movement in different directions, taking into account different struggles, taking into account different manifestations of affections on emotions that when they're materialized through Twitter or different statements, reshaping the movement in a circular, messy, and wonderfully intersectional manner. So these kinds of conversations, I think, are really interesting. And we see them when we take into account the conversation between the different struggles and the different approaches that focus on particular notions of justice in terms of the environment, gender, sexuality, ableism, heteronormativity, and several other axes, of course, racism and others as well. So I think it's both. That's, in a sense, my conclusion, right? It's a little bit sometimes of a usage that tends to miss some of the deeper opportunities that these discussions bring. But at the same time, some of the scholars that are engaging with these discussions really have a lot to say, or the movements and the intellectuals and the activists have a lot to say and a lot to teach. So I think that would be my answer to the question, Garrett.
Great, thank you all. We have just a little bit of time for with some great audience questions that are coming in. So I think I'll just put a couple of these on the table for us, and we can take, feel free to jump in and grab a part of these questions. Some important questions about what intersectionality continues to mean for the theory and practice of peace building, for the field of peace studies. So a question here is, so how can we reconcile the dilemma created by neoliberal international peace building agendas and radical grassroots agendas? And then maybe kind of inflecting that question a little bit more, for international peace building actors, such as foreign aid agencies, INGOs, and so forth. Intersectionality seems, and I think this is coming out a little bit, especially in Dr. Scauso's final comments here, seems to be conflated more and more with this idea of diversity and inclusion. And so as scholars and practitioners in the field, how do we reconcile the tendency of peace-building actors to, quote, whiten intersectionality and to, quote, undo the potential for moving more radical social agendas forward, as Surma Bilge critiques? So how do we maintain the kind of radical thrust of intersectionality, even as we're trying to incorporate it within an established academic discipline and academic spaces? And so those questions may be taken together. And then a second question, noting, I think, some tensions around the increasing prevalence of intersectionality within the field, but also this idea of calling us towards something new. Noting that Kimberly Crenshaw came up with the term intersectionality in 1989 to name a pattern of Black feminist thought and practice that predates the term, but gives us this concept in 1989. the term seems a natural fit for the field of peace studies, but still it has taken decades for it to enter the field and become an important analytical lens. Why do you think this is the case? And what does it mean in terms of finally coming around to using this term, given the call that we're hearing for something new? Can a term that is, with such a well-established provenance now be a pathway to something new for the field? And so any parts of that you all want to grab onto, please feel free. Yeah, Dr. Stavrovska.
Right, so I'm going to start with the second question. I mean, I will answer the second question, and then others can jump in on the first. And I will start answering that question by what we mean by peace studies. I think that part of the answer might be there. The disciplining of the boundaries of what peace studies is one way of finding an answer of who is considered to be a peace scholar and by whom. That's one thing. And the other thing is the resistance of many scholars, journals, of many gatekeepers, I would say, to let different voices in. I mean, we still have a whole area called the local turn of peace studies that completely ignores decades of feminist research, not even intersectionality, feminist research. And how do you, and at every ISA I hear the same thing. Oh, the feminists have arrived, now is their time. I mean, how long is this is the feminist take going to be new? And so, to then come to terms with intersectionality is another beast entirely. So I think one thing is resistance, but the second thing is of who is in the field and who gatekeeps the field. The number of times that you would get feedback from peer reviewers, now it doesn't happen as often, but in the past, where you need to clarify what intersectionality is, how is this applicable, and so on. But what we lose by not having intersectionality more, or what we gain rather by this becoming a little more, I don't want to say integrated, because it's not about integration. I think it's about actually shaking things up and pointing to the different forms of violence. I think what we gain by that is having a more holistic understanding of peace, having an understanding of peace that understands that just being in harmony, and this is drawing on Frantz Fanon a little bit, being in peace, being in harmony with the existing system, it doesn't make the system less violent. It just means that you fit within a system that's already violent. So I think it allows us to have this better understanding of what peace can mean.
Wonderful,
Maybe
thank you. Oh, sorry, no, go ahead.
Can I just add a word to that one? I'll just add a word from my own experience with Catherine Koh's question. And this was in some of these difficult dialogue projects in Colombia, particularly around a project where we were extending the work from Colombia to different Latin American countries. And the hubs and the drivers of this project on the ground were different LGBTQI rights groups. And the funder of this project was on board with that part of it, but the whitewashing was remarkable. And in that case, so just a very practical strategy that worked for us was to notice that the funding agency in this case was using the language of intersectionality in order to justify and to encourage what we were doing. But in this particular, and so we were able to just notice that they were using that language and then invite them to allow us to engage it in a more robust way. And that we were successful in at least in inviting some self-reflection within the agency, and they allowed us to expand what we were doing in a number of countries. So I think even working with the term itself can be effective, can be, at least in this instance it was. And then one word on Asher's question, Asher Kaufman, is this also, Garrett, do you want us to speak to both of them right now?
Sure, you can go ahead, yeah.
Okay, can everyone see Asher's question?
Oh, no, they can't. So that was the second question we asked about
Oh, okay.
why it's taken so long for intersectionality to work its way into the field of peace studies, despite the fact, again, coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, and what that means in terms of the call that we've had from several of our panelists to move on towards new realities.
I would say, I mean, it seems to me that one of the reasons is that we've been so reliant on Galtung's notions of structural violence, and that has seemed to be, and because it is there's strong definitions of cultural, symbolic, and structural violence, that has eclipsed the resources that we have to think about the engendering of these forms of violence, and then how then the spaces that thinking within the interstices of these spaces, what that might allow. But then does that, particularly given Justin's call for something new, where intersectionality is anything but new. I think that at least in the field of social ethics that is concerned with peace building, it is opening some new spaces. And like I was saying earlier, the ways in which womanist and mujerista thinking has done some of that, I think has opened up some of those imaginaries. But at the same time, and I think that there are ways too that we can work with some of those insights from the imaginaries that are opened, like we see in the mujerista and the womanist thinking, to think with that possibility in peace studies, to kind of uplift the kinds of possibilities that exist. But I think it's that identifying the ways in which the engendering of structural violences and then noticing the possibilities therein. I think just uplifting that is what will help us to move forward.
Fantastic. Dr. Scalzo or DeLeon, and closing thoughts? Let's do Dr. DeLeon first and then Dr. Scalzo.
Thanks. I think that's a great question from my perspective of trying to think through why has it been tough to sort of implement, and also why has it been slow moving to move into peace studies, thinking about intersectionality. I think it's a difficult task that requires a critical approach. And I would use critical and radical as pretty synonymous here, which is looking at sort of the foundational structural elements of change that need to be in place. So critical and radical being synonymous in this case. So I think of Eileen Morton Robinson has this great book called The White Possessive. And in there, she identifies these different layers. And one of them is sort of like the hegemonic space will call for color consciousness. And I think largely that's kind of what the first question was looking at, thinking about diversity and inclusion. And then it talks about a second layer where folks of color will actually ask for structural change. And I think we see some of that. And I think Jana had mentioned something about that as well. Lastly, what Eileen Morton Robinson puts forward, which is not really talked about much in many peace spaces, is around land. And how she connects it to land is actually saying that this structure that we're talking about is rooted within capitalist values, and capitalism anchors itself with property and land. And so we have these multiple layers which are sort of mandated by an intersectional approach, which we don't even know how to do yet, right? What does structural change look like? We know what color consciousness starts looking like. We don't really know what structural change looks like, let alone thinking about how do we actually foreground land as a sort of set of principles of ownership and displacement. I think the field has to really start getting comfortable with, as it's been written in other places by Vanessa de Oliveira, this notion of surrendering arrogance, right? Which is that other sort of the tail end of knowing that there's other worldviews and other ways of organizing peaceful communities and so on. So that is to say that, can we suspend our arrogance as a field enough to make space for different interventions to be sort of put forward, and at the deeper level of structure and even land and capitalism? That's why I think that this stuff is so difficult to implement, is because there's such a large structured thing that we're trying to dismantle. That said, one of the ways that I like looking at this is not necessarily how do we take these and employ them over there, right? So things to employ in a system. There's a 2017 book called A Third University as Possible, and Wayne Yang, writing under La Paperson, talks about this notion of cyborg, which is that we are already part of the system. We're already part of the system. And looking at our specific location to smuggle in
and sort of decolonize those particular spaces. He uses the reference to that we should all be like R2-D2. R2-D2 sort of sneaks into the Death Star, uses its instruments to smuggle in rebels. Margaret Kovac, a Plains Cree scholar, indigenous woman, talks about, in our research, are we making space or taking space? So to me, I wouldn't say it's necessarily one or the other, that we have to take this and move it into there. I would say that we're already there. We're already in the spaces that need to be transformed. And now it's just a matter of sort of smuggling. It's a matter of making space. It's a matter of these small little implementations that can be definitely doable rather than thinking about that large structure of capitalism, of these other structures of land ownership and possession. Thanks.
Thank you. Dr. Scouso.
Yeah, I could not agree with you anymore, with all of you. I mean, the resistance to some of the more radical aspects of intersectionality and the tokenizing of these categories, I think that I was talking about earlier, I think kind of speaks to this in a sense, right? Neoliberalism comes in with notions of multiculturalism and diversity that utilize specific stereotypes that can be sold, that are drive, in order to be able to sort of create somewhat of a symbolic sense of inclusivity, but at the end of the day is just marketable, sellable categories that are stereotyped and sustain the same form of violence that categories tend to create against inclusivity, diversity, fluidity, or wet categories, as queer theories would talk about, which I absolutely think is an amazing concept. And I think that intersectionality and decoloniality move beyond that. It's the possibility of constructing sites of solidarity that may play with power momentarily, but at the same time understand the violence of power in and of itself, of the categories themselves. So you may play with the categories momentarily, but understand the violence of the categories, therefore moving beyond them. Also, when this approach plays with categories, it talks about privilege. It doesn't just talk about a sign in I don't know, a sign in the dining hall. It talks about privilege. It talks about the benefits that some have at the expense of others, both in terms of representation, of voice, of money, of land. And so when we start asking those questions and we ask, why does a president of a university have the same salary as 15 scholars or 15 potential faculty, things get radical very quickly. And even at the university level, and the conversation becomes heated very quickly. So I think that the approach brings these things into very much onto the table, and these things have a very radical possibility. And the last one, neoliberalism is one way of being, knowing, feeling, and understanding the world. It is one approach, one discourse. If we're going to think about decoloniality and intersectionality, that discourse itself has to lose its privilege. So that requires for the university to think about pedagogy, to think about land, to think about a lot of other things beyond neoliberalism itself. So in a sense, a space of worlds for multiple worlds deconstructs the universality of neoliberalism. And that to me is very radical. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, I want to thank all of our panelists today for their really rich insights. I know I'm going to be sitting personally with a lot of the things y'all shared today, particular how I can better embody R2-D2. But thank you all so much for what you have meant to the Kroc Institute, for the work that you've done here and out in the world since you have left us. But it was wonderful to have you all back. Thanks so much to our attendees, to everybody who submitted their questions. And we encourage you all to look the Kroc Institute's website to find more information about the Institute's initiative on intersectionality and justice and for future upcoming events. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.